The call came on a Thursday morning in October, and Daniel Voss almost did not answer it. He did not recognize the number. It had a 423 area code, which was Eastern Tennessee, which was a place Daniel had not thought about in any meaningful way for almost 10 years. He was standing in his kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, coffee in hand, already running slightly late for a meeting, and he looked at the number for 2 full rings before he picked up. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Nurse Caldwell from Whitfield County Medical Center. She said she was calling regarding a patient named Gerald Voss. She asked if Daniel was Gerald's son. He said he was. She said his father had been admitted 3 days ago with advanced pancreatic cancer and that his condition had deteriorated significantly overnight. She said Daniel was listed as next of kin. She said he might want to come. Daniel stood in his kitchen for a moment after he hung up. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the window. Outside, the October sky was flat and gray over the Columbus rooftops. He thought about Gerald Voss. He thought about the last time he had seen him, 10 years ago, at a gas station outside of Erwin, Tennessee, a chance encounter that had lasted approximately 4 minutes and ended with both of them getting back into their respective vehicles and driving in opposite directions. He thought about the 10 years before that, the years of his childhood and adolescence in the house on Birch Hollow Road, a house he had left at 18 and returned to as rarely as he could manage. He called his office and told them he had a family emergency. He packed a bag. He drove south. The drive was 6 hours with traffic, through the long roll of Ohio farmland and then down into the mountains of eastern Tennessee, the landscape shifting under him as he drove, flattening and then rising, the trees on the ridges gone to their fall colors even in the gray light, red and orange and the particular yellow that only October produces. He had not made this drive in a decade. He had not missed it. But he found, as the miles passed, that his body remembered it in the way bodies remember things that were once routine. The specific sequence of exits and highways, the landmarks that had not changed, the way the mountains appeared on the horizon and then grew and then surrounded you before you fully registered that they had. He did not know what he was going to say to his father. He was not sure his father would be in a condition to hear it. He was not sure, if he was being honest with himself, that there was anything left between them that needed saying. There had been a time, in his 20s and early 30s, when he had imagined some version of this conversation, a reckoning, an accounting, the kind of scene that movies about fathers and sons always seem to arrive at eventually. He had rehearsed versions of it in his head and on paper, and once, memorably, out loud in a therapist's office in Columbus. But 41-year-old Daniel, driving south through the October hills, did not feel the pull of that imagined conversation the way he once had. He felt something quieter and harder to name. He felt the specific weight of someone driving toward a thing they had spent a long time driving away from. Gerald Voss had not been a violent man. Daniel wanted to be precise about this because the story of a difficult father was so often told in terms of violence, and he did not want to tell a different story by using the wrong frame. Gerald had not hit him. Gerald had not been cruel in the ways that left visible marks. What Gerald had been was absent in the way that is harder to explain and, in Daniel's experience, harder to recover from, present in the house but not in the room, there at the dinner table but not at the dinner. A man whose attention was always located slightly elsewhere, on the farm, on the weather, on the slow financial worry that had characterized Daniel's entire childhood, on anything except the boy sitting across from him who was trying year after year to find a way to be seen by a father who did not seem to know he was looking for something. Daniel's mother, Ruth, had died when Daniel was 14. That was when the absence had become something harder. Before Ruth died, Gerald had been distant but present, if that distinction made sense, the way a house can be cold but still standing. After Ruth died, the house became something else. Gerald went into himself in a way that Daniel, at 14, did not have the tools to understand, and that Daniel, at 41, understood too well. The grief had taken Gerald somewhere Daniel could not follow, and Gerald had never come back from it. Not fully, not in the years that Daniel was still in the house waiting for him to return. Daniel had left at 18 and put Distance between himself and Birch Hollow Road with the systematic intent of someone who understood. That distance was the only thing keeping him functional. He had gone to college in Columbus on a partial scholarship and worked the rest. He had built a life there, a career in civil engineering, an apartment he had owned for 8 years, a small circle of friends who knew him as a steady and reliable person, which was what he had become partly by choice and partly by opposition to what he had grown up with. He had not gone back to Irwin often. He had not talked to Gerald often. The calls between them, in the years when there were calls, had been brief and practical and had trailed off entirely in the years after the gas station encounter, which had not been an argument exactly, but had been the kind of exchange that made argument unnecessary because it had made clear to both of them that there was no longer any agreed-upon ground on which to stand. He arrived at the hospital at 7 in the evening. The parking lot was half empty. The lobby was the particular beige of medical facilities everywhere, the same lighting, the same linoleum, the same quality of compressed and recycled air. He found Nurse Caldwell at the third-floor nurses' station, a woman in her 50s with the specific competence of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had not become numb to it, but had learned to hold it steadily. She told him his father was awake but tiring easily. She said the cancer had spread to the liver. She said they were managing his pain and keeping him comfortable. She said Daniel should prepare himself for the possibility that Gerald had limited time, perhaps days, perhaps a week. It was difficult to say. Daniel thanked her. He walked down the hallway to room 312. Gerald Voss was smaller than Daniel remembered. This was the first thing, and it landed with a specific force because Gerald had always been a large man, broad through the shoulders, built for the physical work of a farm, a man whose physical presence had been one of the primary facts of Daniel's childhood. The man in the hospital bed was still recognizably Gerald, but reduced, the way a structure is still recognizably itself after the weight-bearing elements have begun to fail. He was 74 years old. His hands on the blanket were the same hands Daniel remembered, large and work-roughened, but they lay still in a way they never had when Gerald was healthy. Gerald's eyes were closed when Daniel came in. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. Then Gerald opened his eyes. He looked at Daniel without speaking for a long moment. His expression was not readable in the way that people whose expressions Daniel had spent decades trying to read were not readable. Then he said, "Daniel, just the name. The way you say someone's name when you are confirming that they are real." Daniel said, "Hello, Dad." He sat in the chair beside the bed. They looked at each other. They did not have the conversation Daniel had rehearsed for years. They did not have any version of it. What they had instead was something smaller and less shaped, fragments of talk that moved around the things that mattered without landing on them directly, the way people sometimes talk when they are too tired or too close to the end of things to manage the full weight of what they mean. Gerald asked about Columbus. Daniel told him. Gerald asked if Daniel was still doing the engineering work. Daniel said yes. Gerald nodded. He asked about the drive down. Daniel told him about the traffic through Dayton and the colors on the ridges coming into Tennessee. Gerald said the colors had been good this year. He said it had been a dry summer, which usually made for a good color season. Daniel said he had noticed. They talked like that for 40 minutes, circling, and then Gerald's eyes started to close, and Daniel said he would come back in the morning. And Gerald said all right, and Daniel drove to the motel on Route 19, where the nurse had said people usually stayed, and checked in and sat on the edge of the bed in his room and looked at the wall. He went back the next morning and the morning after that. On the third morning, Gerald was more alert than he had been, which the nurse said sometimes happened near the end, a temporary gathering of energy that was not recovery, but something else. Gerald asked Daniel if he had been out to the house. Daniel said he had not. He had driven past it on the road to and from the hospital, but he had not stopped. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said Daniel should go out to the house. He said there were things there. He said he wanted Daniel to have them. Daniel asked what things. Gerald looked at the window. He said Daniel would know when he saw them. He said the key was under the same rock it had always been under, the flat gray one to the left of the front steps. He said this in the way you say something you have known for decades and never had occasion to say out loud. Daniel drove out to Birch Hollow Road that afternoon. The house was not what he had expected, which was to say it was not the version of the house that had existed in his memory for 30 years, the house of his childhood, the house that had been defined by what it lacked and what it asked of him and what it could not give him. The house he pulled up to on a Thursday afternoon in October was old and weathered, but it was not neglected. The porch boards were solid. The windows were clean. The yard was small and orderly, the grass cut short for winter, the flower beds along the front cleared and mulched. Someone had cared for this house. Someone had been caring for it for a long time. Daniel sat in his car for a moment looking at it. Then he got out and found the key under the flat gray rock to the left of the front steps, exactly where it had always been. Inside, the smell hit him first. Wood and old fabric and the particular quality of a house that had been lived in by one person for many years. Not unpleasant but specific, the smell of a life. He stood in the front room and looked around. It was not the front room he remembered. Or it was the front room he remembered, but it had been changed, rearranged, and cleaned and made into something that was more intentional than the room of his childhood had been. The furniture was old but cared for. There were photographs on the wall. He walked to the photographs. There were 7 of them, framed and hung in a row above the old sideboard. He stood in front of them and looked at them one by one. The first was a photograph of his mother, Ruth, that Daniel had never seen. She was young in it, maybe 20, standing in a field he did not recognize, laughing at something outside the frame. She was so alive in it that Daniel had to look away for a moment before he could look back. The second was a photograph of Daniel. He was maybe 8 years old, sitting on the porch steps of this house with a book open in his lap. He did not remember the photograph being taken. He did not remember anyone taking photographs when he was a child. He had not known this photograph existed. The third was a school photograph, Daniel at 12, in the particular style of school photographs from that era, the blue background, the forced smile. He had not known Gerald had kept this. The fourth was a photograph Daniel recognized from his college graduation. He was standing in his gown outside the engineering building. He had sent this photograph to Gerald. He had not known if Gerald had received it, had never gotten a response, had assumed it had gone into a drawer somewhere or been thrown away. The 5th, 6th, and 7th photographs he did not immediately understand. They were photographs of things rather than people. A building, a bridge, a road. He looked at them more closely. He recognized them. The building was the municipal building in Dublin, Ohio, on whose structural assessment Daniel had led his first major project 12 years ago, a project he had been proud of, and that had been written up in an Ohio engineering trade publication. The bridge was the Clearwater Pedestrian Bridge in Worthington, a project from 8 years ago that had won a state award. The road was the reconstructed stretch of Route 40 outside of Columbus, on which Daniel's firm had done a significant drainage and foundation overhaul 3 years ago. Daniel stood in front of these photographs for a long time. He did not move. He looked at each one and then at the others and then back. He thought about where these photographs had come from. They were not photographs Daniel had sent. They were not photographs anyone had taken at the time. He thought about Gerald Voss in this house on Birch Hollow Road, in the years when they were not speaking, in the years when the silence between them had become so established that Daniel had stopped expecting anything to cross it. He thought about Gerald finding these photographs, looking for these photographs, printing them or cutting them from wherever they had appeared, and framing them and hanging them above the sideboard in the front room of the house where Daniel had grown up. He sat down in the old armchair by the window. He sat there for a while, then he got up and walked through the rest of the house. In the kitchen he found on the small table against the wall a cardboard box with his name written on it in Gerald's handwriting, the same handwriting that had appeared on the rare birthday cards of Daniel's childhood. Large and slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man who had not written much. He opened the box. Inside were letters. Not many, perhaps 20 or 25. He picked up the first one and unfolded it. It was a letter to Daniel. It was dated 11 years ago, the year before the gas station encounter, the year Daniel had turned 30. It began. I have been trying to write this for a long time, and I do not know how to do it right, so I am just going to write it and hope that right enough is sufficient. He read the letter standing at the kitchen table. Then he sat down and read it again. Gerald had written about Ruth. He had written about what her death had done to him in a way that was not an excuse, but was an explanation, offered carefully and with a specific awareness of the difference. He had written that he had known, in the years after Ruth died, that Daniel needed something from him that he did not know how to give, and that this knowledge had been a source of shame so constant that he had responded to it the way he responded to most things he could not manage, by retreating from it, by going into the work and the farm and the practical necessities of survival and staying there because staying there meant not having to face the thing he could not fix. He wrote that he had understood this was not adequate. He wrote that understanding it had not been enough to change it, and that the gap between understanding and changing was the thing he had lived inside for most of Daniel's life, and that he did not know how to explain that gap except to say it was real, and it had cost them both something he could not give back. He had not sent the letter. None of the letters in the box had been sent. Daniel went through them one by one, sitting at his father's kitchen table in the October afternoon light. There were letters from 11 years ago and letters from 7 years ago and a letter from just 3 years ago and several undated ones that could have been written at any point. They were not all long. Some of them were a single page. Some were 2 or 3. They were not polished. Gerald was not a man who had been educated to write, and the letters showed the effort of a man reaching for language that did not come naturally, finding it in pieces, the sentences sometimes working and sometimes not quite working, but always clearly trying. What they were, collectively, was an attempt. Not a successful one in the sense of having arrived, having been sent, having done what a letter is supposed to do, but an attempt in the deeper sense, the sense that mattered. A man sitting down, repeatedly over more than a decade, to try to say what he had not been able to say in person, to try to bridge a distance he had created and could not close, to try to reach his son through the only medium left to him after the in-person opportunities had collapsed. Gerald had tried and had not sent the letters, which was a failure of nerve or of confidence or of something else Daniel could not fully name. But the trying itself was there on the table in front of him. 20-some pieces of paper that represented 20-some occasions on which Gerald Voss had sat down and tried. Daniel did not go back to the hospital that afternoon. He stayed in the house on Birch Hollow Road until it was dark, reading the letters and then sitting with them and then walking through the house again, looking at the photographs above the sideboard, looking at the house itself with new eyes, the eyes of someone who has just understood that a place they thought they knew meant something different than they had believed. He went back to the hospital the next morning. Gerald was awake. He looked at Daniel when he came in and waited. Daniel sat in the chair beside the bed. He told Gerald he had been to the house. He told him about the photographs. He told him about the box. He said he had read the letters. Gerald looked at the window. His hands were still on the blanket. He said he had meant to send them. Daniel said he knew. There was a long silence between them, not an uncomfortable one. Daniel thought about the word meant. He thought about the distance between meaning to do something and doing it, a distance he had spent a great deal of his own life navigating. He thought about the years he had meant to call and had not called, the years he had meant to come back and had not come back, the easy symmetry of that. He said, "Dad." Gerald looked at him. Daniel said, "I read what you wrote about Mom, about what happened to you after she died." Gerald did not say anything. Daniel said, "I didn't know it was that bad." Gerald said it was that bad. Daniel said, "I know." There was another silence. Then Daniel said, "I should have come back sooner." He said it not as a performance and not as a rote line from the scene he had rehearsed, but as a simple, true statement about what he actually believed. Gerald said Daniel had his reasons. Daniel said so did you. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Gerald died 4 days later. Daniel was in the room. He had been there most of those 4 days, leaving only to sleep a few hours at the motel and to eat something and then coming back. They had talked. Not about everything. There was not time for everything, and some things had missed their moment by too many years to recover it. But they had talked in the way that men who are very like each other talk when they have finally stopped pretending they are not. In the short, direct sentences of people who have run out of reasons to speak indirectly, with the specific honesty available to two people when one of them is dying and the pretenses that organize ordinary life no longer apply. Gerald had told him about the photographs. He said he had found the municipal building article in a trade publication someone had left at the feed store in Irwin 3 years after it was published, that he had torn it out and taken it home and then thought about the bridge and the road and spent an afternoon looking for images and found them and printed them. He said he had put them up on the wall because he wanted them in the room where he spent most of his time. He said he wanted to be able to look at what Daniel had built. Daniel had not been able to say anything for a moment when Gerald told him that. Then he said he had not known. Gerald said he knew Daniel had not known. He said that was on him. Daniel said it was on both of them. Gerald said maybe. He said it had been mostly on him. Daniel drove back to Columbus on a Wednesday morning, a week after he had driven down. He had arranged for a local funeral home to handle the arrangements and for the house on Birch Hollow Road to be looked after until he could return to deal with it properly. The mountains were behind him and then below him and then gone. He drove north through Tennessee and Kentucky and into Ohio, through the flat farm country north of Cincinnati, and he thought about the photographs on the wall and the letters in the box, both of which were in the back seat of his car. And he thought about what they were and what they were not. They were not enough. They were not the father he had needed as a child, or the relationship he had needed as a young man, or the repair he had spent years wishing someone would offer. They were not any of those things. They were what they were, which was a man trying. Inadequately and too late and in the wrong direction, but trying. Reaching for his son through the only medium available to him after the in-person medium had failed, across the distance of a silence that both of them had built and neither of them had been able to close. Daniel thought about the word enough. He thought about what it meant for something to be enough. Not sufficient, not complete, not more than it was. Just enough. In the specific sense of being what it was and being real and being the actual thing rather than the performed version of the thing. He pulled off the highway outside of Dayton to get gas. He stood at the pump in the Ohio afternoon, the flat fields around him, the pale October sky. He took his phone out of his pocket. He thought about who he wanted to call. He thought about the people in his life who did not know where he had been this week or what he had found there. He thought about the conversations he had been meaning to have and had not had. He put his phone back in his pocket. He finished pumping gas. He got back in the car and drove. But that evening, in his Columbus apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with the box of letters open in front of him, he took out a pad of paper and a pen. He was not a man who wrote letters. He had not written a letter since he was in college. He sat there for a while looking at the blank page. Then he picked up the pen and wrote, "I have been trying to figure out how to say this for a long time." He looked at that sentence. He thought about Gerald sitting at a kitchen table in Irwin, Tennessee, beginning the same way. He thought about what it meant to be a man who reached for words when the other things had failed. He thought it was not the worst thing to be. He kept writing. "Before you go, I want to stay with this for just a moment." Gerald Voss never sent the letters. He framed the photographs and hung them on the wall of a room his son never visited. And he wrote the words in letters his son never received. And he looked at what his son had built from a printout he found at a feed store. He loved his son in a way that never quite found its way out of him into the world where his son could receive it. That is a painful thing. That is a real thing. And maybe you are watching this and you recognize it. From one side or the other, the loving that stays inside, the reaching that does not arrive, the distance that both people built and neither knew how to close. I am not going to tell you it is fine. It is not fine. But I will tell you what Daniel found when he drove back to that house. Evidence. Not of a perfect father. Not of a repaired relationship. Just evidence that the love was there, imperfect and misdirected and unable to find its way to him, but there. Sometimes that is the thing that makes it possible to pick up a pen. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found out, too late or almost too late, that someone loved you in a way you could not see? I want to hear from you. Share this today with someone who needs to know that the quiet love counts even when it never finds its way out. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.